Ready? I'll tell you the story of my grandfather that I heard from my mother. Однажды, когда в деревне было очень много людей, он просто пришли и забрали у него полный кусок дома. My mother told me the story when I was a little girl, and this is a story about my grandfather living through these times that I read in my speech. He was just having a house and living in a village, and then one day those people from the government, they came with the huge tools, instruments of assimilation, language, and big instruments, and they just came and took a part of his house in the village to make him equal, to make him belong to the community, to make him part of the community, to include him in the community. They took everything from him to make him part of the ideal community of communism. They took everything from him. He took his identity. They accommodated him to belong. He had to give up everything he had because he had a little bit different house. He had different ideas about society and different ways he approached the world. They didn't care. They thought they were right. They thought they were bringing up the ideas of equality. They thought they were giving more rights to him. And took everything apart. My mom told me that she just watched them as they ripped everything apart with those tools of the government, and he didn't say anything. He didn't stood up. He didn't say no because he couldn't. He had a family. He had people he cared about. He had people he loved, and he couldn't. He accommodated. He assimilated. He agreed to those terms they gave him, and then in a few days he died. He just couldn't. He couldn't become part of the community. He couldn't see everything, his identity, and everything he had, everything he lived through, all his cultural experiences of living in a country where it's taken from him. They took his house, they took what he owned, they took his cultural ideas to accommodate him, and he just couldn't live that. My grandmother, she was stronger. She had children, and she lived through that, and she accommodated the government, and Stalin was such a terror that people were afraid of him. They were afraid to speak up to him. They pretended they were in opposition. They pretended they were different. There were some communities formed against him. There were some people who were trying to be different, to say include more. Let's make something different, but it was all the same ideas. It was still under Stalin. Even if they were different, even if they were trying to make things better, include more rights, it was all the same story. It was all the same. There's this call to action, call to make things better. What would you do? How would you act? Would you express the opposition? Would you go with the government? Would you make things different? What would you do as a person? That's the question. How? I mean, how do you express opposition to those abusive terror? How do you stand up against the violence? There are rules. There are rules. We have to speak a certain way. We have to discuss arguments. We have to speak language a certain way. There are arguments where you pretend to be resistant, but you're playing the same rules. And I would like to think that I would stand up, say stop, don't do this. But how? When people tell me have a discussion in my classes and classrooms and lecture halls, they talk past me. They don't get my accent, my cultural experience. They think I'm just like them. But they try to accommodate. They tell me, let's have a discussion, let's deliberate, be part of the society, but they talk past me. They bring this idea of equality, of competition, of literature, but they talk past me. And let's tell you the things about the people who came from the government. They came with the tools of language. They came with those huge tools of, we have to speak the same language. We have to be the same. We have to speak. They were pretend to speaking for themselves, but they weren't. They weren't speaking for themselves. They were speaking for the others. They were speaking for the government. And they were in effect with the arguments they brought up to kill, to break up things, to make everyone equal. They didn't think about our arguments truthfully. They pretended. They believed. They pretended they were making things better. They were pretending and believing, but they weren't because they were playing with the same rules of including more to exclude more, by including more to kill more. What tools Stalin used? Stalin used a few tools. He also, to mobilize and make those people from the government come to him, he used the tools of assimilation and accommodation. They put others as a threat. He used the rhetoric of Christ, of threat, of those huge idealistic things that never happened. He used it of other countries. He didn't have interactions with other countries. He didn't have discussion with other countries. He pretended he only had one perspective to engage into those countries, and he posed all the countries as a threat to mobilize his own citizens. to mobilize everything in his own country. Everyone became a threat, and this idea of superiority, idea of a threat is what allowed him to mobilize population in his own country. To mobilize youth, people like my grandfather who experienced this. At first, war was informal. At first, war the Stalin had was everywhere. But then, it became specific. By giving that speech, he made this war actively specific in specific geographical location. He declared this war on specific territory. And so by declaring this war, making it more specific, he was able to kill more people. This allowed him to include more, to then kill more by including more, by accommodating the ideal community, the idea of giving more rights. He was able to kill my grandfather. He just thought everything was taken from him. And then, when I hear this story from the mom told me, I'm just asking myself, what would I do? What would I do if someone came to me with those tools and took everything from him? Would I say no, or would I just stand there? I don't know.